Welcome to the final part in the series of presentations where we're looking at the prophecies of Jeremiah. In this part, we're going to be looking at how God relates to other people groups. Just looking back for a moment or two, we've now seen that Jerusalem fell exactly as predicted by Jeremiah. Historically, and there are good records of this, the siege lasted for quite a period of time. But the city eventually fell, starved out. But there were many months right into the next year of 586 for the clean-up operation. And all this confirms that what Jeremiah said would happen did in fact come true. The temple wealth was stripped out. The homes in the city were destroyed. The walls were flattened. Many of the leaders were executed. King Zedekiah was blinded. Those who had skills were deported to Babylon. That took many months to organize. And a reliable governor, a former court official, totally reliable, was appointed. It is now a province of Babylon. But he was assassinated, and then there was a bloodbath. And a group fled south for Egypt, thinking of Babylonian reprisals. There were army commanders in this group, army officers in this group. There were also some royal princesses, unnamed, who'd escaped through the whole thing. A small group of the Jewish population, and Jeremiah plus his secretary Baruch were taken under duress against their will. And Jeremiah warns the group of the consequences of doing this. They are to stay in the land. That's what God wishes. They ignore him. Two groups left the land. The refugees, they chose to flee south. The Babylonian deportees, they were forced to move to Babylon. Blatant determination to ignore Jeremiah. In utter confusion. How has this happened? Why has God allowed it to happen? Their mindset was closed to listening to God. And Jeremiah predicted that, and history shows that is true. Eventually the penny dropped. Took a generation or two. They'd brought the disaster on themselves. It was entirely their own fault. Jeremiah, the great prophet, Baruch his secretary. Baruch had served faithfully, but he was disillusioned. People just simply wouldn't listen to his master's message. A few did, but the vast majority, especially those in leadership, chose to ignore it. Baruch was disillusioned, but looking back from the perspective of history, Baruch edited the book, put it together, and without his commitment, we wouldn't have this book today with its immense value for us, speaking to us messages from God. Now, looking at the people groups, I'll list them with the chapter references. In a moment or two, we'll look at a map and see where they lay. Very quickly giving an overview of this long section. Egyptian power was eventually broken by Babylon. Jeremiah predicted it. Philistia was just wiped out. Moab lost its national identity after being overrun. The same happened to Ammon, and the same happened to Edom, all lands to the east of the Galilee, the River Jordan, and the Dead Sea. Damascus to the north was crushed by Assyria first, and then it was wiped out by Babylon, absorbed. The Arab tribes from the desert areas, they were harried by Babylon. Elam to the far northeast was eventually absorbed into the Medo-Persian Empire. And then there's a huge stretch devoted to Babylon. It was taken over and the entire empire disappeared from history, and the city today is an archaeological site. Now, there are various comments that have been woven in by the editor. Encouragement: the exile is not endless. There would be an end. Jeremiah predicted it. History shows it happened. A comment on the nature and power of God, Yahweh. And then Jeremiah enacts the prophecy against Babylon to show his confidence that what he said was going to happen would happen. History shows it did happen. Now, looking at the map, just very approximate areas: the great Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire to the bottom left-hand corner, Israel and Judah caught between, wiped out and absorbed. Philistia, coastal area on the edge of Judah. Edom to the south. Moab to the east. Ammon to the east of Israel. And the Damascus area, roughly in the area edging into Syria and around Syria today. Arab tribes all over the place, areas where they could move from oasis to oasis. Elam is far away, the other end of the empire, edging into what is now Iran today. That's where chapter 46 starts. This is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the nations. This is the message against the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was defeated at Carchemish on the river Euphrates by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, king of Josiah, king of Judah. God was interested in more than just the people of Judah. He's interested in all humanity. And here are prophecies that were given at various times in Jeremiah's speaking over the years, and Baruch has pulled them together as a collation at the end. This one's dated. Jeremiah spoke about these at various times. These groups, these people groups, influenced, affected Judah in all sorts of ways historically. Most of them just disappeared as nation states from the world stage. Egypt perhaps the exception. The fascinating and amazing thing is, despite its tiny size, Judah retained its national identity. That's the miracle. The nation state went on, re-established itself, and from that nation state in due time, Jesus was born. Very different from the other people groups round about. Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel. I will surely save you, rescue out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant, for I am with you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. Perhaps the last sentence could be better translated, I will not hold you totally innocent. They deserve to be wiped out for their behavior. But God was faithful to them, took them through the exile and re-established them. They didn't lose their national identity. They didn't lose their God, Yahweh, the God of the universe. Other people groups did. They were restored. And if we look back, that's the message of many of the great prophetic figures. The exile was permitted in it. It was the only way by which the people of God could be brought back to place Yahweh central in personal and national life. The people of God had a destiny, a purpose, because from that nation Jesus was to be born. They failed again and again and again, and the exile was necessary. In the exile, under the careful leadership of Ezekiel, the penny dropped. They saw the significance of what they'd done. They saw where they'd gone wrong. They started to put things right. They started to long for a better way. And in due time, their descendants, their grandchildren, came back and re-established Judah and the temple and God at the center of life. Looking at Egypt, Pharaoh Necho had moved north in 609 BC to assist the Assyrians. They were on their last legs. The Babylonians were about to flatten them. Pharaoh Necho lost out. As the Egyptian army moved north, King Josiah went up against Egypt, sensing he should go with Babylon. He was fatally wounded, and that was the beginning of the disaster, because his sons were disastrous kings. Necho lost everything. Small fortress in the upper Euphrates area, that was all that was left. And he was totally routed by the Babylonians later. The Babylonian army a year later started to move south to get their revenge against Egypt. Pharaoh Hophra made grandiose promises, but he failed to keep the promises, and he was eventually assassinated. And much later, and Jeremiah predicts this, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Egypt, defeating Pharaoh Amasis, a successor, and this stopped any further Egyptian threat to Babylon. He just put them down. Jeremiah saw it this way: daughter Egypt will be put to shame, given into the hands of the people of the north, that's the Babylonians. The Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, I'm about to bring punishment on Ammon, god of Thebes, that's a god of the Egyptians, on Pharaoh, on Egypt, and her gods and her kings, and on those who rely on Pharaoh. I will give them into the hands of those who want to kill them. That's Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers. Later, however, Egypt will be inhabited as in times past, declares the Lord. That's what happened to Egypt. Its power as an empire was finished once and for all. The nation state did go on and did recover. Moab, a land that lay to the east of the Dead Sea, they had their own god. Every tribal group had their own god. Quite good for growing grapes. Persistently attacked and had a go up Israel. Tended to go with Babylon, and it tended to act against, historically, the northern and the southern kingdoms. And there are numerous prophecies, because they were a thorn in the flesh to the people of God. Persistent, continual, attacking, pillaging, stealing land, stealing crops. They got their comeuppance. That's what Jeremiah predicted would happen. It did happen. We don't even know if Jeremiah was still alive when it happened, because he went to Egypt and died there. They were just wiped out. And Arab tribes just took over the land, encroached. They disappeared from history. Concerning Moab, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says: Woe to Nebo, for it will be ruined. Kiriathaim will be disgraced and captured. The stronghold will be disgraced and shattered. That's cities or areas in Moab. Moab will be praised no more. In Heshbon, her capital, people will plot her downfall. Come, let us put an end to the nation. Moab is disgraced, for she is shattered. Wail and cry aloud, announce by the Arnon that Moab is destroyed. That's the river. Was not Israel the object of your ridicule? Was she caught among the thorns, that you shake your head in scorn whenever you speak of her? We have heard of Moab's pride. How great is her arrogance, of her insolence, her pride, her conceit, and the haughtiness of her heart. I know her insolence, but it is futile, declares the Lord, and her boasts accomplish nothing. Woe to you, O Moab! The people of Chemosh are destroyed. Your sons are taken into exile, your daughters into captivity. Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in days to come, declares the Lord. They continually attacked God's people. In the end, they were wiped out by Nebuchadnezzar. They lost their national identity, but people groups did continue on in the area. Philistia, pretty devastating. For the day has come to destroy all the Philistines and to remove all survivors who could help Tyre and Sidon to the north. The Lord is about to destroy the Philistines, the remnant from the coasts of Caphtor. They were just simply wiped out and they vanished from history. The Philistines, who had been a thorn in the flesh to the people of Judah, gone. Nebuchadnezzar saw to that. Ammon. His prophecies were dated about 600 BC. It lay to the north of Moab, that's to the right of the river Jordan, if we look at the map. They had their own god. They kept infiltrating the Transjordan areas of Israel and took control of quite a lot of it. Became semi-autonomous under Assyria. Made some sort of arrangement with Babylon. And indeed Babylon used conscripts from Ammon in the army. But eventually Nebuchadnezzar lost patience, wiped it out. It lost its identity as a nation. Later, one of their rulers was implicated in the assassination of Gedaliah. That was the administrator that Babylonians had put in charge of the province of Judah, an able and godly man. But the land was later taken over by Arab tribes and it's now part of modern Jordan. National identity lost. But people groups did continue on. Edom. Prophecy is dated. But there's a lot of prophecies in the Bible about Edom. Isaiah, in the 8th century BC, he saw that Edom would collapse. Here Jeremiah saw the same thing. Ezekiel, a little bit later, overlapping with Jeremiah, he saw, but he understood why it would happen. But Obadiah, he saw it was about to happen. God spoke through these great men and revealed the same story, and it developed a developing picture. Now what actually happened was this: Nabateans, who were from the north, steadily took control. By the 5th century they had vanished as a people group. Now they were wealthy because they were on key trade routes. They also had built very, very powerful fortresses, rock fortresses carved out of the rock of the area. Despite all of that, they were unable to resist, and their culture just simply vanished, along with their language and their identity, exactly as these prophets had foreseen. Let's look at the map just for a moment again, looking more closely at the area around about Israel and Judah. Now, the green area of Israel and Judah was what they owned when they were at their peak, probably in the days of David and Solomon. The people groups around about. Edom is a large group. Now, there's a long history of animosity against Israel. They'd come from the same bloodstock originally. Esau, the older twin brother of Jacob, had married people from that area and had settled in that area and had linked up with all sorts of other people groups, which eventually formed the nation of Edom. And they were continually having a go at southern Judah, stealing crops and land. But that was the characteristic that's pictured by Jeremiah. Self-sufficiency, impregnability, and pride. We can look after ourselves. We can protect ourselves. We are the greatest. Just think about some of the nation states in the world today. How close that is as a picture of some of the things that are going on in the 21st century. You see, people groups that live for the material and ignore the purposes of God, they face disaster. People groups who harry the people of God, undermining their role. Now, Edom was characterized by both these pictures. They lived for the material, on trade routes, wealthy, well protected. God just didn't figure in their way of life. But they kept having a go at the people of God of Judah, stealing, pillaging, harrying, attacking. Over the centuries that had happened. If we simply ignore God and live for the material, eventually the culture just simply implodes and disintegrates, falls apart. You see, we were made for God at the center of our individual personal lives, but also in the center of our cultures. God made us. He knows what's best for us. When we live His way, following His direction, life is at its best. If we choose not to do that way, then things start to fall apart because we don't know how to run our lives. God knows. But cultures that go one step further and harry God's people are ripe for destruction. Now, there are prophetic significances for what's going on today in the world. There are cultures that are harrying God's people. China, North Korea, Putin's Russia, many parts of the Islamic world. But also it's beginning to show in Western cultures. There's a warning there that we've got to ponder. Edom lost its identity. It was just disappeared from history. And if you look at the history of the world, that has repeated itself again and again and again. There are very deep messages from Jeremiah for the world of the 21st century. So what Jeremiah said is, there no longer wisdom in Teman, city of Edom. Has counsel perished from the prudent? Has their wisdom decayed? They thought they were clever. Now I will make you small among the nations, despised by mankind. The terror you inspire and the pride of your heart have deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, that's their fortresses, who occupy the heights of the hill. Though you build your nest as high as the eagles, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. They thought their fortresses were impregnable. They were brought down. And now to the north. Again, it has its own God. the area fell to the Assyrian warrior king Tiglath-Pileser III, but it came under Babylonian control. There was quite a lot of jockeying for power between the northern kingdom of Israel and the area surrounding Damascus. The Arab tribes, perhaps not a discrete people group, but scattered groups of nomads who wandered the desert from oasis to oasis. This prophecy is dated. Historically, that was always true. There were endless skirmishes between the desert tribes and the settled areas. Ashurbanipal, powerful ruler of Assyria, took punitive raids against them to get them under control. But Nebuchadnezzar, just as Jeremiah predicted, started to attack them. And then Elam away to the northeast in the Iranian area. Again, this prophecy is dated. It was conquered by the Assyrians. It worked with Babylon to defeat the Assyrians and destroy Nineveh, the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. But there started to be clashes between Nebuchadnezzar and those who lived in the Elam area. Eventually it was absorbed into the Persian Empire. Jeremiah could see that the clashes were going to happen. He understood the mind of God and what was happening in the area. Much of this section is devoted to looking at Babylon. Now just let's remind ourselves that Jeremiah, he started prophesying in 627, taken to Egypt in 586, or roughly that time, and he died there. Now the Babylonian Empire replaced the Assyrian Empire around 612 BC. Later, the great warrior king Nebuchadnezzar. His son didn't last long, assassinated by his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law took the throne, didn't last long. His son only lasted a few months. A gap of chaos, and then Nabonidus took over. And eventually, the Babylonian Empire fell. Cyrus, the Persian ruler, captured Babylon in 539. By very clever means. You see, it all fell apart after Nebuchadnezzar, and so often it does, after a powerful ruler who's flattened everything round about, jockeying for power, and it just all falls apart afterwards. We see that again and again in history. But at the time of Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar was still highly powerful, yet Jeremiah could see what was going to happen. Babylon will be captured. Bel will be put to shame. Marduk filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame. Her idols filled with terror. A nation from the north will attack her and lay waste her land. No one will live in it. Both people and animals will flee away. In those days, at that time, declares the Lord, the people of Israel and the people of Judah together will go in tears to seek the Lord their God. They will ask the way to Zion and turn their faces towards it. They will come and bind themselves to the Lord in an everlasting covenant. They will not be forgotten. My people have been lost sheep, says Jeremiah. Their shepherds have led them astray and caused them to roam in the mountains. They wander over mountain and hill and forgot their own resting place. Whoever found them devoured them. Their enemies said, we are not guilty, for they sinned against the Lord, their verdant pasture, the Lord, the hope of their ancestors. Flee out of Babylon, leave the land of the Babylonians, and be like the goats that lead the flock. These are the Babylonian gods. They would disappear from history. The Medo-Persian Empire would take over the land from the north. But when that happened, the exiles in Babylon, the descendants of the people of Israel and Judah, will say, what are we to do now? By that time they had learned to seek God in his ways. The penny had dropped where they'd gone wrong. And God's answer is, get back home. And that's what happened. The fall of the city was by stealth. It wasn't destroyed immediately. There was no great major onslaught. But it went into terminal decline and simply vanished. It's now an archaeological site. For I will stir up and bring against Babylon an alliance of great nations from the land of the north. The Medo-Persian Empire was that group. They will take up their positions against it from the north. She will be captured. Their arrows will be like skilled warriors who do not return empty-handed. So Babylonian will be plundered. All who plunder her will have their fill, declares the Lord. Babylon would suffer the same fate that the Babylonians had served up to others. But what's the significance of all of this for God's people? Because that's the focus of what Jeremiah is saying. For Israel and Judah have not been forsaken by their God, the Lord Almighty, though their land is full of guilt before the Holy One of Israel. Flee from Babylon, run for your lives, do not be destroyed because of her sins. It's time for the Lord's vengeance, he will repay her for what she deserves. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand, she made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken, wail over her. Get balm for her pain, perhaps she can be healed. We would have healed Babylon, for she cannot be healed. Let us leave her and each go to our own land, for our judgment reaches to the skies, it rises high as the heavens. The Lord has vindicated us. Come, let us tell in Zion what the Lord our God has done. God had not let his people down. The exile they'd brought on themselves by their persistent, willful disobedience. There in exile they were surrounded by evil, but under the careful leadership of Ezekiel, they'd been drawn back to God. They'd protected themselves from that evil. They started to learn the lesson. And by the time the Medo-Persian Empire took over, perhaps it was near the grandchildren stage, the penny had dropped. They were ready to go back. Babylon had gone. Great significance of Babylon going. Get back, re-establish your nation in Judah. They did. It was tough going, very tough. Because God has come to put things right. He allowed you to go into exile because there was no choice. You brought it on yourself. Now he's going to rescue you and take you back. You see, Babylon had forced its ways in life on many nations. But it was all going to collapse, and it did. Jeremiah could see it. And long after his lifespan, it all happened. Babylon is a type of organized society against God. It seems so powerful, so invincible. But in the end of the way, it all falls apart. But God's people go on, and the history of the world shows it. If only we'd learned the lesson. God still wanted to rescue and heal the Babylonians. Indeed, there are stories in Daniel, the book of Daniel, of God touching the life of Nebuchadnezzar. If only the leadership had been willing. But we look at the mess that happened after Nebuchadnezzar went. See, God acts in justice. He's there to put things right. Remember the word vengeance? It's not retaliation. That's not what the word means. It means God acts in justice to put things right. He rescues his people. We don't deserve it. They didn't deserve it. But God's in the business of rescue. He wants the best for all humanity, if only we will listen. Now in chapter 51, there's a repetition of chapter 10, and it's here for a very good reason. It reflects on God himself. He made the earth by his power. He founded the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens by his understanding. When he thunders, the waters in the heavens roar. He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouse. Everyone is senseless and without knowledge. Every goldsmith is shamed by his idols. The images he makes are a fraud. They have no breath in them. They are worthless, the objects of mockery. When their judgment comes, they will perish. He who is the portion of Jacob, God's people, is not like these. For he is the maker of all things, including the people of his inheritance. The Lord Almighty is his name. This sets the whole thing in a kind of context. God made this entire world. He made this entire universe. And when we go our own way, and when we make the creation our God, then we lose out. Our societies lose out. Our relationships fall apart. But when we make God the center, the portion of Jacob, he is the maker of all things, when we put him at the center of life, then God can do wonderful things. That's his purpose. He knows what's best for humanity. You could summarize it this way. God is the creator and sustainer of the entire world. And it is pointless stupidity to worship what is merely created. And in the West, we are moving that way, tragically. We're worshipping our security, worshipping our intelligence and ability, worshipping our wealth, worshipping our technology and advances, worshipping all that we've achieved. And in the process, we're destroying our societies. The Babylonian people and all the gods that they had set up, and the people groups round about, were just the same. Useless. They had no meaning. They were human creations. And when the crunch comes in the West, the gods that we have created, they won't do anything for us. And our society will simply fall apart and be ripe for takeover. There are great and deep lessons in this. Babylon is used as a picture in the Bible in the New Testament as to represent a godless society, human organized society which pushes God out completely and goes its own way. The damage it causes to people groups all around, the damage it causes to people groups within it, the damage it causes to everything round about. But in the end, it doesn't survive. It just falls apart sooner or later. And we can look out in the world today and we can see that happening. We've got the great nation of China. By fiddling its exchange rate, manipulating money, it creates unrealistic wealth for itself. But it's destroying any people group within its grasp, within its empire which is ever growing. It destroys them. The media tell the story of what they're doing to the Muslims, but in fact there's a far greater destruction going on of the Christians, which has been going on for longer and more brutally. The suffering of people there. Any people group that doesn't conform to the gods of China is being destroyed. North Korea is even worse. And if we look at Putin's Russia, we have the tragedy of the Orthodox Church, which has come on board with Putin because it's getting the backhanders. But every other religious and ethnic group is suffering as a result. And anyone who opposes ends up on false charges in prison or is assassinated. It's a repeat of the Babylonian story. You can see that in many countries of the Middle East and North Africa. The same pattern is occurring. but you can see it beginning to grow in the west. Oh, there are great warnings from this prophecy of Jeremiah for us today. Prepare the nation for battle against her, against Babylon. The kings of the Medes, their governors, and all their officials in all the countries they rule. The land trembles and rises, for the Lord's purposes against Babylon stand. That's true of today's Babylons. To lay waste the land of Babylon so that no one will live there. Babylon's warriors have stopped fighting. They remain in their strongholds. Their strength is exhausted. They become weaklings. Her dwellings are set on fire. The bars of her gates are broken. One courier follows another, and messenger follows messenger, to announce to the king of Babylon that his entire city is captured. The river crossing seas, the marshes set on fire, and the soldiers terrified. It's a grim picture. It happened. And it will happen in the modern day Babylons. You see, Babylon seemed invincible. Not to God. And there are nation states in the world today that seem invincible. They're anti-God, but they're not invincible. God will bring them down totally. There's a prophetic word for our world today. It is a frightening picture, but it's also a reassuring picture that God is still in control. And eventually he will say enough is enough. And to God's people, do not lose heart or be afraid when rumours are heard in the land. One rumour comes this year, another next. Rumours of violence in the land, and of ruler against ruler. For the time will surely come when I will punish the idols of Babylon. Her whole land will be disgraced, and her slain will all lie fallen within her. Then heaven and earth and all that is in them will shout for joy over Babylon. For out of the north destroyers will attack her, declares the Lord. That happened. But when you're up against it, and it looks like in the west we're going that way, hang on to that confidence. Final epitaph on an organized society organized against God. The sound of a cry comes from Babylon, the sound of great destruction from the land of the Babylonians. The Lord will destroy Babylon. He will silence her noisy din. Waves of enemies will rage like great waters. The roar of their voices will resound. A destroyer will come against Babylon. Her warriors will be captured, and their bows will be broken. For the Lord is a God of retribution. He will repay in full. He will put things right. That's the final epitaph on Babylon. Wipe it out. The principle behind this? Empires that can be pictured as human organized arrogance and power. Rulers who set up empires that way. A lot of them in the world today. Empires where there's human dependence on weapons and defenses. Let's be reassured. Whatever may happen, whatever suffering God's people have to go through, God has infinite power and He will put things right. The history of the world shows it's true. Long chapters on the fall of Babylon, probably collated together from various parts of Jeremiah's ministry by Baruch his secretary. But you see, the impact Babylon had on all the people groups of the Middle East at that time was simply enormous. It wasn't a long period of time, historically, but it changed the lives of people groups all over the Middle East. But that's God's perspective. This is what the Lord Almighty says: Babylon's thick wall will be levelled and her high gates set on fire, and peoples exhaust themselves for nothing. The nation's labour is only fuel for the flames. The walls of Babylon were so thick you could drive a couple of chariots side by side along the top. They protected themselves, armed themselves, made themselves so wealthy, it all just fell apart. Habakkuk had said the same at an earlier point. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labour is only fuel for the fire, and the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? Look out in the world today. The nations are exhausting themselves for nothing. This is the message Jeremiah the prophet gave to the staff officer Seraiah, son of Neriah, son of Mahaziah, when he went to Babylon with Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 4th year of his reign. Jeremiah had written on a scroll about all the disasters that would come upon Babylon, all that had been recorded concerning Babylon. He said to Seraiah, when you get to Babylon, so you read all these words aloud, then say, Lord, you have said you will destroy this place, so that neither people nor animals will live in it. It will be desolate forever. And it is today. When you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the river Euphrates. Then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster I will bring on her, and her people will fall. The words of Jeremiah end here. 4th year of Zedekiah's reign is about 594-593. Zedekiah had gone on an emissary to Babylon. There already were exiles in Babylon. So Jeremiah takes the opportunity to send a message to these exiles to give them hope, and all the details of how we got it there and what to do. You see, Jeremiah was so completely confident that all this would happen, that he was prepared to enact it out, or this staff officer Seraiah did it for him, to give the exiles hope that the exile would not last forever. Babylon would fall. Their descendants would return. Babylon will sink to rise no more. What a word of confidence. Now the prophecy of Jeremiah ends there, but there is another chapter. But the central message of the whole book is this. And the chapter at the end reflects back on history. You rebelled against God. That's the message of Jeremiah to the people. You pushed him to the margins of your life. You lost his protection and direction. You brought the exile on yourselves. God still cares for you despite all you've done. You don't deserve it. Accept the exile, learn from it. Get God back at the center of personal and community life. Won't go on forever. Babylon will collapse cataclysmically, and it did. You will be able to return. Well, at least it'll be your grandchildren. Start again and learn how to be the people of God. There's a great message in this for the people of God in the West today. We're making a terrible mess of things. We're rebelling. We're not living the way God wants us to live. We're not doing what God wants us to do. A kind of exile is facing us if we're not careful. Put our house in order quickly. But that was the message of Jeremiah, the central message of this whole book. But the last chapter is an appendix which brings it to life. Much of it is a repetition of 2 Kings. It describes the fall of Jerusalem, the sacking of the entire city, the execution of leadership, and the taking of exiles. All that Jeremiah predicted would happen did happen, and history shows it's true. But it finishes with that. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year of Awel Marduk became king of Babylon, the 25th day of the 12th month, all very precise, he released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and freed him from prison, probably from a close house arrest. He spoke kindly to him, gave him a seat of honour higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king of Babylon gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived, until the day of his death. Now Jehoiachin had become king at the age of 18. He was the son of Jehoiakim, the grandson of Josiah. He lasted just a few months because he'd been put on the throne by the Egyptians, and the Babylonians didn't want it. So they took him into captivity about the age of 18. So this is the year 561, after the times of Jeremiah. He'd be about 55. God was still looking after his people. He'd endured 37 years of exile in a foreign land. We don't know anything about whether the penny dropped with him or not, but we do know this. He had a grandson called Zerubbabel. He came back with the returning exiles to Judah and became their leader. Not a king. Kingship had gone. He became their leader. He was a godly man and worked with the high priest, who was also a godly man. And they started to set up the people of God in Jerusalem, to establish their homes, their agriculture, their temple, get God back into the center of their national life and rebuild the nation. There is a message from history which has been put at the end of the book as an appendix, but it's not really an appendix, it's a great message of hope. There is a future. Hope rising from the ashes of this disaster. Jeremiah is a book that has so much to say to us today, throughout the world and in the West particularly. And there are disasters facing God's people. And there are disasters facing God's people in the West because of our persistent, rebellious disobedience. We're more interested in running our church systems than living the way of Jesus. But even out of that, there's a message of hope arising from the ashes of disaster. Let's take hold of this. Let's be positive. Let's put our house in order. Let's move forward. And let's see God at work in new and exciting ways. Hope arising from the ashes of disaster. A great message from the book of Jeremiah.